dentalcover.ie by VHID Care, helping families smile with confidence.
Alright, coming up later on the programme, I'm going to be talking to a chocolatier, so hopefully he's bringing some chocolate in, although chocolate's bad for the gout, so I may have to pass it. And Seb Coe, Olympic medalist, MP and the power behind London 2012, is my guest on the Thursday interview just before 6:30. But now I'm joined by the managing director of Buyers Broker and herself the author of Irish Property Buyers Handbook, Tallon. Carol, welcome to the programme.
Thank you, George.
Now, the reason we asked you to come in is that we are getting indications of what the property tax is going to look like. First, are these leaks, are they credible to you?
I absolutely do believe they're credible. They first appeared by Fionnan Sheehan in the Irish Independent. I believe they're credible for one very simple reason. They're wholly consistent with what the government themselves have been saying and what they've been indicating over the last 2 to 3 months. And to my mind, this is how the government have actually prepared us for what's coming in the budget.
Are they? So property tax is going to be in the budget?
There seems no doubt about that.
All right. How do you do this, given that nobody has an idea what a piece of property is worth anymore?
Well, we've got a slightly better idea in some areas now since the publication of the National Property Price Register. So that only came into force there in October. And I do believe that we've actually been waiting for that since the 70s. And I believe it was rushed this year, despite promises over many years, purely because the government needed it in order to introduce property tax. So we would have predicted that the price register would have been published this year in advance of the budget, because that's the only way that we can judge market value. But we can't even do that for right across the country.
So I'm going to have to pay my property tax. So now because it appears this is self-assessment, I'm going to decide what my property is worth. Is that right?
That's it, but it's going to be within a bandwidth. So you will define the value and market value, which, to be honest, even the professionals have difficulty doing, but you'll define the market value within a bandwidth of 50,000. So I'm sure the temptation will be to err on the side of going to the lower 50,000 rather than the higher. So
so let's say I pick a figure. Who now argues with my figure? The first sense is the revenue commissioners, because the revenue commissioners say, hold on here, you paid us tax on a low valuation. So then, presumably, they have to get a valuer who comes in and says, yes, the self-assessed value of the house is too low.
Well, I would imagine how this is going to work, and obviously we don't have the details as yet. But in actual fact, thanks to the Property Price Register, there's unlikely to be a valuer going out to your house. There's more likely to be a Revenue Commissioner official looking up the National Property Price Register and looking at the transactions. There's up to 50,000 transactions there at the moment, and they'll be looking for one closest to your area, and they'll be trying to see that it's consistent. What I would worry about is that because there's less than just slightly under 50,000 transactions on that price register, for people particularly outside of Dublin or outside of urban areas, it's going to be very difficult to actually match them up with something already appearing on the register.
In urban areas, would you see a situation where, say, the association, the residents association representing 50, 100 houses or whatever in that development, that they would the committee would advise people, look, the value for these houses is. Would you see something like that happening?
I don't actually, and
really?
To be perfectly honest, it's because I think that if you put in a room, you put these people together, most are going to have a slightly skewed opinion on the value of their homes, because we see that at the moment anyway. And most people think that if you spend 20,000 on your garden, redoing your garden, that your house is worth 20,000 more. That's just not the reality. Likewise, if you think your decor is particularly superior to that of your neighbours, you would put the value of your home at a higher level. Again, that's not necessarily the case. So actually, I don't see the Resident Association really playing a role in this. And in fact, it would probably be quite dangerous for them to do it, because we do know that there will be penalties for people who are found to have significantly underestimated the value.
If we take about 250,000 is about average for, say, Dublin, isn't it? If we took a figure of 250,000, how much property tax would you pay?
500.
500. And Now, the budget's in December, so you will pay 520.13. Is that right?
No, actually, only 50% of the amount is going to fall due on the first year. Now, that's actually a little bit misleading, really, because people are going to fall into the property tax thinking that it's not as high as it is, and obviously their liability for 2014 will double. So the way to work it out, and what I would suggest to people, is that the figure of 0.2% of the value of your property has been talked about, but it could actually be as high as 0.25. Now that does create a difference. At 0.2% of the value of your property, you can roughly work it out at €100 per 50,000.
Okay, so that's where you got your 500 from, on a 250,000 house. I said in the beginning, self-assessment. So each taxpayer will say, my house is worth. Now, what, do you like that as an idea?
With self-assessment, I don't have a difficulty with self-assessment in theory. What I do have a difficulty with is that the National Property Price Register is showing less than 50,000 transactions. So it hasn't been backdated before the end of 2010. So there's simply not enough. So it's fine if you live in a 3-bed semi on a certain road and another 3-bed semi has sold there within the last year. Then you're okay. You have some gauge of market value. Whereas if you have an unusual property, and in fact just this morning I spoke to somebody who has a mill and there's cottages, derelict cottages that are not income producing, so there's no inherent value there. And she was saying to me that in better times the property may have been worth $1 million. Now, you know, it would be a fraction of that. Where to go about valuing that property? An unusual property is going to be difficult to value, even for a professional. So how can a layperson be expected to do this when the bank can't do it, the state couldn't do it? Professionals have been doing it wrong consistently for years without penalty.
All right, if everybody's been getting it wrong, the revenue are going to find it very difficult to penalise somebody unless there is some, you know, you put it in at 100 and it's clearly 400. But there would have to be a wide divergence before the revenue could really, with any certainty, come in and say you've made a false declaration.
Oh, absolutely. And in fact, I think the Revenue Commissioners will surely be aware that they will have to take a very flexible approach to this, because as well as that, you have to look at what property is moving at the moment. It can be said that for the last 2 years and 3 years that we have a record for, the properties that have been selling have been perhaps more motivated sellers. I won't call them distressed sellers, but they're certainly sellers who were willing to take a price cut. So there's an argument to be made that in certain areas where there's very small sectors of the market, and particularly say residential market in South County Dublin is starting to recover, there's an argument to be made there that in actual fact the value should be higher than what we're seeing recorded on the price register, but the opposite will be true for rural areas.
Getting back to the revenue though, it will be, the revenue likes certainty and they like facts. So when you come along and you say, last year I earned so much money and I paid so much money in tax. Now the revenue then, either you've underdeclared or you haven't, and the revenue can then, with certainty. But this property tax, in one sense, is a bit of a nightmare, because it's his opinion, it's the revenue man's opinion versus yours. Is that not so?
It absolutely is, and I've no doubt it's going to be an absolute headache. And the one thing I would definitely point out here is that the government this time last year were not expecting to have to deal with the property tax this year. In fact, the household charge was being brought in as an interim measure. So it would have been far preferable for the government if the household charge had been successful. Then that could have remained for a couple of years until they had a better handle on the market, until they had some stability and that market value could be defined. As it happens, there was huge protests, and I'm sure that people didn't realise it at the time, but in fact by protesting to the household charge for €100, they've actually tripled in some cases their liability, because it moved the date for the property tax much sooner.
But this property tax replaces the household charge.
It does, but in actual fact, if the household charge had worked, it would have been in place for 2 to 3 years at least as an interim.
Now, my guest on the programme is the Managing Director of Buyers Broker and also the author of the Irish Property Buyers Handbook, Carol Tallon. Brendan says, on property tax, he pays it on a house in Derry. The difference between Northern Ireland, there's a bit of a spat between Mary Lou MacDonald and the Taoiseach. And Taoiseach said somebody in Antrim pays about £1,200 on their house. The stamp duty, of course, will be a lot less in the United Kingdom, isn't that so?
I'm not familiar with the stamp duty there.
Yes, but it is.
I would point out that they also pay commercial or rates similar to our commercial rates, which we don't pay. And actually, one of the things that I think hasn't come into this discussion at all about property tax is you pay a tax to get something in return for services. So what are we getting in return for this property tax? I think that's really, I actually think that this is some clear communication from the government about this might actually ease some of the tension that's going to happen.
I suppose the reason there isn't a clear communication is you're not going to get anything for it. I mean, this is just simply a tax. And they could have taxed us on our shoes. Wouldn't make any difference.
I heard somebody make a very relevant point actually that that because the government they actually have to raise a minimum of 500 million with this, although the IMF obviously wanted them to raise $1 billion with it. When you have a target like that, actually what you're imposing is not a tax, it's a levy.
Yes.
And so a tax is something you pay and you get a service in return. But in actual fact, this property tax is a levy, and if nothing's been offered in return, that's what's going to cause people to become more disgruntled about it. And as well as that, there's certainly confusion at the moment, and I'm looking forward to Budget Day to hear how this is going to play itself out in terms of exemptions and deferrals, because it certainly looks like very few people will be getting exemptions, which actually is probably fairer. The system of deferral as opposed to exemption is actually a fairer system.
But Carol, the question from a listener here is that if you're in negative equity has nothing to do with this. It is the value of your house today, irrespective of what you paid for it.
Absolutely, it's the value of the house, not the value of the mortgage. But unfortunately, and this is why we really want to see what way the exemptions or the deferrals are brought in, because in actual fact, I'm expecting, because the first-time buyer relief was cut, we know that's the end. That's finishing at the end of this year. I'm expecting some sort of home buyer or first-time buyer incentive. Now, I genuinely hope that it's not going to be an incentive by way of exemption from the property tax, because in actual fact, impending buyers, and I work with buyers, so they're the people that I represent, but even so, I would have to say that first-time buyers are in a better position to afford this property tax than people who bought at the height of the boom, who are in negative equity. So they're the people I think that should come actually in line for the exemptions and the deferrals. But unfortunately, this government doesn't always reward the people that should be rewarded. And in fact, if I hear that clip of Minister Noonan talking about this is going to affect most the people who can afford it most, how dare he? He doesn't know who can afford it most. The people who are earning less, the people who are earning more, the people who are earning in the middle. He doesn't know who can afford it most.
I think we might have that clip from Minister Noonan. Can we
Don't play it again.
No, we will. Go on, play it again, Sam.
You know that thousands have paid out huge sums in stamp duty.
Thank you.
And then you come along.
Don't appear to have it. That was Eamon Gilmore. We have it. We went deep into the archive.
Deputy. I think people are expecting a very tough budget. I think that's the feel on the ground. But I want to assure everybody that while we have to make the adjustments that we have to make, it will be fair. It will be a fair budget, impacting most on those who can afford it.
Yeah, you don't like that.
I reject that entirely. How dare they even make the assumption that they know who can afford it? You've got people, I fully agree actually that middle income earners are absolutely being targeted the most, because they come in line for all of the charges and levies and they don't come in line for any of the exemptions. However, I would say that that's probably true for some of the higher earners at the moment, again, who bought in the boom times, because they're carrying such a liability that it makes statements like that incredibly unfair.
The difference between this property levy and a property levy it is, and property taxes in the past, is for centuries property was an indication of wealth. If you owned property, then you had something of value. The problem for so many people today is they have property of no value. And therefore therefore, to assume that somebody has a house for 500,000, that's no value if they paid $1 million for it. I think if I played Noonan's clip again in my head before I go to sleep, I'll be as mad as you are tomorrow morning.
Good.
My guest on the programme, Carol Tallon, Managing Director of Buyers Broker, and of course, as I said, the author of Irish Property Buyers Handbook. Many people asking how the government going to police the payment of the property tax when they're unable to collect the household charge successfully. I'll tell you, there's a big difference between owing money to the revenue and owing money to the civil service.
The Right Hook. Thanks to dentalcover.ie.